Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagement here at Barnblog, and today we're going to do something a little different. I'm covering a center leftist, or a liberal, really. A guy who used to work for the Tonight Show with John Oliver, has appeared on Jesse Singal's podcast. Not the kind of figure I'd normally cover, because I want to cover something historically, and the way a lot of people seem to think that history started in 2016, or at best at the end of the Obama administration, is sort of a problem. Now, I'm actually not one to speak much about the culture of the United States for the Obama administration, because for most of the Obama administration, almost 8 years of it, I was only there for year one. I was not in the United States. I came back in the first year of the Trump administration. So, which, unbeknownst to me, somehow is 7 years ago, because that's how time works and it keeps moving forward like a fucking arrow. But nonetheless, it's something to think about. Jeff Maurer is my age, almost exactly my age. He's way more successful than me, was on the pulse of the era of smungness around Jon Stewart, and he has moderated. What I find interesting about these kind of figures is that I find it fascinating where I agree and don't agree with them. They take blue MAGA to be the left, and I probably dislike those people even more than Jeff does. But nonetheless, it's something for us to consider in a historical process about how the left orients to this kind of person, right? We can pretend all day that most people think like us. The reality is that they don't. But they don't think like Jeff Maurer either, although probably a lot more of them do statistically than they think like us. The issue is trying to parse where the social world is, and that actually doesn't require you to engage in some of this shit. There's a reason why I occasionally read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, even though I think most of the punditry in that is utter shit. Nonetheless, you got to do what you got to do. So we're going to engage with this and see where this goes. This is called The Great Dumbening by Jeff Maurer. All right, it's important to remember this is from 2 years ago. So this is from, probably before the build up to the last set of midterm elections. All right, so we start off. I'm going to do alt text here with this statement of the left. Maybe we might call this the Brianna Wu statement of the left. There's the right staying still. There's the center. There's someone left of center. There's the left. 2012, the right, the center, the left. 2021, the right, the center, and the left way over here. Now, fellow liberal, woke progressive, whatever, right? This is the way this is framed. Now, interestingly, from my standpoint, this has also probably more profoundly happened on the right, nor that these simple binary spectrums really explain much. But I do think Jeff Maurer actually is right to critique this. And I'll just read here. Recently, Elon Musk, a man I simply can't get myself to care about, me neither, tweeted, or X as this case, so we don't dead brand him, tweeted the cartoon shown above. It got a lot of attention, and I understand why. It's hard to deny that something is happening on the left. Yes, it's fragmenting. And when it fragments, it tends to cluster around various cultural issues and also double down on particularist readings, just like the right did, actually. And I'm not saying that as a form of equivocation. I just think that there is a certain media logic to this. I thought about the stick figures for, frankly, way too long. It was hours, and I eventually started to feel like I was pondering the allegorical subtext of a Marmaduke cartoon. There's good old Marmaduke. That bone clearly represents START, nuclear treaty, so Marmaduke is Gorbachev. People who are far better at political analysis than I have looked at what the data exist to try to determine if progressive liberals, whatever, have moved to the left in the past decades. Matt Iglesias, noted enemy of the show. I actually have not pissed Matt Iglesias off, but he's pissed me off since he started writing, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago. So, that late Gen X smug liberal sound. I remember when he wrote a Democratic apologia for sweatshops. So, he's a fun guy. And Milan Singh looked at the party platform, and David Shore and Philip Bump weighed in. The consensus seems to be that left is somewhat more left. Of course, this is a tricky analysis. After all, who counts as the left? Yes, who? Most of the people you would probably consider, Jeff, I don't consider. Which opinion matters? What does moving left even mean? These are fair questions, but rather than let them bog down what an otherwise interesting discussion, I prefer to wave them away with the wise words of the mostly naked Will Ferrell, who asked, "Why are bushes bushy? If we're going to get into that area, we're going to have to be here all day." I think the cartoon represents something real, but I also think it's missing some context. What follows is the cartoon as I would draw it, in which I look to objective metrics as possible, but in which I am admittedly going to largely go by feel. This is one person's perception. Take it for what you will. Panel 1, the 1990s. Me, a teenager. Me too, I was a teenager. Conservatives moving to the right. By the end of the 1990s, the shift from the Reagan coalition to the moral majority to the opposition to Clinton was a shift to the conservative side, and in ways that are somehow hard to recapitulate today, because one of the things that this will obscure is, well, yes, conservatives have been moving to the right. Which right they're moving to shifts constantly, even in the same person, even in the same time period. Is Trump a neoliberal or a paleo-conservative or both or neither or some kind of new economic nationalist or right populist? Well, it depends on the day. Anyway. Did you know there used to be a thing called the Northeast Republican? It's true. They could be found in New England and were usually the villain in National Lampoon movies. They were very into boats and shirts with little logos in the left breast. They liked church, and not all that life-affirming kind of church where you wear a fun hat and sing upbeat songs. They preferred the dour type of church where you read pre-written prayers and apologized to God for your genitals. They were horrified by all things improper. They were incensed by Jimmy Carter's Mr. Rogers casual attire and turned on Nixon when he was shown to be a rule breaker and a potty mouth. They weren't really fire breathers on race, and they were integral to passing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. George H.W. Bush was a quintessential Northeast Republican. Yes, he was, although the fact that he was in the CIA should also indicate something about the nature of that group. He ended up being a divisive figure in the Republican Party. Writers like Jeffrey Cabaservice and E.J. Dionne have chronicled the intra-GOP revolt that happened in response to Bush's 41's not conservative enough for some presidency. After all, it led to the rebellion of a lot of defectors, both from the left of George H.W. Bush and the right of George H.W. Bush, into the most successful third-party run in modern history, at least since World War II, and that was Ross Perot's run. After Bush lost, the newly ascendant right won big in the 94 midterms, which was dubbed the Gingrich Revolution. That's when I was politically aware myself, by Newt Gingrich at least. The GOP made Rush Limbaugh an honorary member of the 1994 Republican freshman class, which is kind of like showing up to a date with a bag full of condoms and sex toys. You're making it perfectly clear where your head is at and what you're hoping to do. Before 1995 and 2015, the proportion of Republicans who called themselves very conservative went from 19% to 33%. Other measures note a rightward shift around the time. You can definitely see it from the moral majority to the neoconservatives, to the Randian conservatives, to the Tea Party, to the Great Libertarian Rebellion to whatever the fuck happened in 2012. Republican office holders in the Northeast and West Coast mostly disappeared. To a large extent, the shift seemed to have been caused by demographic sorting. Yep, a lot of those people moved to the South and became more conservative. And the disambiguation of parties that happened as the Dixiecrats disappeared. The great ideological sorting. You know, one of the things about the Nixon strategy that we often don't talk enough about, yes, there was a Southern strategy of appealing by dog whistles to ex-Confederate Democrats, or Confederate sympathizing Democrats. They weren't Confederates. Confederates were long dead. That took a long time to happen. I mean, I've talked about this a lot in my 20 years, but I remember being 20 years old when the governorship of Georgia went to a Republican. Now, we've had conservative Democrats for most of our time, but, you know, Zell Miller and Sonny Perdue were different people. And that shift was profound and sudden, and the Dixiecrats who were left didn't get voted out of office. They literally changed their names from R to D. And this was in 2000. This is not in the fucking 70s. All right? And so this idea of the deep red South, you know, that even I kind of remember, because it was my early adulthood. You know, I was one of the people who doubted that Biden could win Georgia, my home state. And I was wrong. Although I'm not sure the Democrats are going to run it this time around. But that you had this weird phenomenon where Georgia became a purple state again. And these old swing states of Ohio and Florida became the most bulwark conservative states, although they have large Democratic minority populations. Often with Democratic Party apparatuses that are totally atrophied because all the resources and money have gone to New York and California, where Democrats can run a shoe and probably win. I don't know why they do that, but they do nonetheless. Anyway, but the efforts of conservative activists who captured the Republican Party also played a major role, which is about as close as I'll get to giving Newt Gingrich credit for anything. And I want to point that out a little bit. The Southern strategy was also paired with Nixon trying to appeal to the Black power community, believe it or not. And he even got some communists on that boat for a little while. Alex Haley, after all, was the Nixonite who wrote Malcolm X's autobiography, effectively. There was a kind of throw spaghetti at the wall, and the Southern strategy stuck while as trying to win the Black community back to the Republican Party, particularly in the Northeast, where it had defected to the Democrats all the way back with FDR. And the South, it had only defected to the Dixiecrats since the end of Jim Crow, but Goldwater's stance on the Civil Rights Act had really pushed, the Southern Black Republicans into the Democratic Party, solidifying that vote. Now, it's hard to talk about what Southern Blacks would have thought about FDR, because in most Southern states, they couldn't vote, at least not in significant numbers. So it's something to think about when we talk about this. But the efforts of conservative activists to capture the Republican Party played a major role, which is about as close as I'll give it to anything. Maurer talks about on an interview that I listened to of him recently that we have to really pay attention to the rise of AM radio and alternative media apparatuses, as well as funded think tanks. And I mean, that seems obvious. All right. The 2000s and 2010s, the center seems vacated. Liberals move leftward. I'm just doing the alt text on that thing here for those of you who are listening. Smart conservatives are kind of to the right, and the GOP is so far to the right they're blowing the brains out. All right, and we'll get to it. In the 2000s, Fox News became a behemoth. Conservative radio proliferated as Clear Channel Communications brought up stations across the country. Conservative bloggers like Matt Drudge and Eric Erickson gained a lot of influence. The right-wing dream of a conservative media ecosystem that existed at least since those meddling kids Woodward and Bernstein got everyone's knickers in a twist over Rotorgate have finally arrived. You got to remember, this is like a 50-year project. Journalism is ostensibly about the truth. Journalism's platonic ideal waxed about constantly in Oscar bait movies like and West Wing monologues is an unvarnished presentation of reality. Cronkite's favorite sign-off is, and that's the way it is, not, and these are the parts you thought you'd like, I hope you had fun. Cronkite's sign-off had a distinct air of like it or don't like it, I don't give a shit, which I think is fantastic. Conservative media took a different approach. What if you decided that the world was like before you gathered the news and just reported the bits that fit the narrative? This game-changing approach, similar to Jack Dougherty's suggestion that comedy writers start with the catchphrase and work backwards. And it worked. In terms of gaining viewers, yeah, this is audience capture feedback loop. Unfortunately, the problem is more responsible than any other factor for the near total brain death of the Republican Party. The writer Tim Urban thinks that viewing politics along a simple left-right continuum is incomplete. He thinks that we need to consider not just what we believe, but why we believe it. And he takes the traditional left-right political spectrum and uses it as an x-axis of a graph that also has a y-axis. The y-axis charts the push and pull between the so-called primitive mind and the higher mind. The primitive mind is the impulse we all have to look out for the immediate needs and safety. It's short-sighted and selfish, and it specializes in identifying bad guys and slaying them. The higher mind represents a more reasoned and broad-minded tendencies. Politics tends to speak to the primitive mind, and of course it does. We spend millions of years evolving those habits, and the idea is that you shouldn't immediately kill your enemies with a rock is a relatively new and edgy concept. Agreed. Urban ends up with a graph that looks something like this. All right, so I'm just going to try to describe this for those listening. Political motivations, truth, and a more perfect nation. The higher mind, political motivations, confirmation, and triumph. The primitive mind, political spectrum, blue to red being conservative, blue being liberal. I hate that fucking news people getting traditional associations wrong. So you have this scattershot plot around the spectrum. In the 2000s and 2010s, the Republican Party came to appeal mostly to the bottom right quadrant of that spectrum. Driven largely by right-wing media, the GOP's animating force became a desire to own the libs. Policy became perhaps a fourth or fifth order concern. It's not a concern at all now. just Derek talking. Which explains why the Trump administration had no major policy goals other than a bizarro world Obama, and why the 2020 Republican convention produced no platform. And the platform that produced today in 2024 is pretty anodyne and stripped of most policy. Dominating liberals is now such a high priority in the GOP that hinting that you'll ignore the results of a Democratic election is treated as a sign of party loyalty than of obvious authoritarianism. I consider the Republican Party to be totally incapable of solving problems. Yes, and I would add to this is because even though it's far right, in quotation marks, it's incoherently so. You paper over it with demagoguery, which is because the elites of both parties have largely failed. Trump is an ideal reptile brain demagogue, and people who don't take his reptile intelligence seriously are often left to the wayside. But as we see, there's a limit to it, and it seems to be coming out these days. I don't want to get into punditry, and this election's been so crazy that I can't even figure out what's going on. But I've never seen a milquetoast primary candidate become the belle of the ball as if she's Obama 2.0 in 2008 in such a fast manner with so little discussion about why and what's on the table, other than fear of Donald Trump and maybe a reframing. I mean, one thing we can say about the Harris campaign is it hasn't actually doubled down on the threats to democracy and the constant fear mongering. Instead, they belittled Trump and J.D. Vance as weird, which probably works because even I am tired of the fucking fear mongering. Even if these people are fascistic, constantly pointing them out as powerful and capable of ending democracy is probably a way that actually helps them look good. All right. Anyway, I think that they become the way because conservative media has distorted their worldview so badly that they've lost the ability to even recognize problems. I would agree with that. This bothers me. I've never identified as a conservative, but I see the value of conservative philosophy. I mean, as a check on liberal philosophy, I kind of do, but you know, they're both kind of a problem for me. I don't. Two wings of a very sick and ailing bird is not something that I necessarily want to fly, since it's going to spread the plague. But nonetheless, there should be someone in society who defends what's already working and doesn't fall for every half-baked idea produced by a pot-fueled rap session in the freshman dorms. The world needs a discerning and principled counterbalance to the occasionally very stupid ideas of the left. I mean, I agree. Sometimes the left's ideas are very stupid, or if they're a good heuristic, they lead to terrible policy, or they're unactionable, etc., etc. Not going to lie about that. The fact that the GOP can no longer platform the function worries me at all. I mean, worries me a lot. This is one of the things of the centrist mind. They get worried of the fact that there's no longer a clear situation in the early 2010s. Okay, so on the liberal side, for those of you who are getting it offside, you have a stick figure claiming brains. You have liberals plus me and the center of the left, which is pretty far left from where it was. You have the center being all muddy. You have smart conservatives being sad, and you have the GOP being brain dead. All right. Now, in the era addressed by the original cartoon, and I agree, something happened. Much has been written about this, including on the left. This panel is my attempt to capture the fact that what I think happened is a bit more complex than the left moved left. A new ideology has invaded the left. Oh no. Wokeism came for the left. This is funny. Nobody quite knows what to call it. A lot of people say woke. Wesley Yang calls it a successor ideology. I say the religious left because it reminds me of the religious conservatism I grew up with. In this drawing, I've depicted a zombie to convey that I think this is something coming from the outside. The outside from where, my bro? This isn't what was there before, only more so. This is something foreign. More than on that in a bit. And I bet the foreign he blames are people like me. We'll see if he goes there. All right. Why did things change when they did? I think it probably starts when the conservative story started with geographic sorting. Blue carts of the country are bluer than they used to be, and the economic stratification has overlapped with the economic polarization. Depending on what circles you run in, you can go a long time without encountering someone who thinks differently than you. Not me, buddy. I live in Utah. The world was recently, in late night political economy, was far enough left to make your typical art collective look like a Proud Boys meeting. And of course, ideologically homogenous environments lead to groupthink, and they're basically human growth hormone for bad ideas. That first bit I think is silly, but that last bit I think is true. And I think this plagues what I consider the left, not the quote woke left that Maurer is whining about. Although some of those people annoy me just as much and make as little sense as Maurer says they do. As a true blue radical leftist, I find a lot of what passes for radical liberalism or radical leftism to be, well, annoying. And mostly the purveyance of students and people who are downwardly mobile, who need a moral justification for trying to claw their way up. And in that, I might sound like a conservative, but I promise you I'm not. Conservatives don't really think about how to abolish private property all that often. But anyway. But I actually think there is something to the demographic sorting. And I also think social media nieces and audience capture, even though it's the purveyance of middle tier, middle brow, middling intelligent, liberal to libertarian academics like Jonathan Haidt, that there is some truth to the fact that these echo chambers are actively bad for you in understanding what the rest of the world thinks, including people who you might share objective conditions and material interests with. ideologically homogenous is not the same as a viable political movement, and even center liberals can see that. I also think that liberal media landscape became more closely resembled the conservative it's built. Mainstream outlets had changed due to the exodus of their conservative audience and by the rise of engagement-based business models. MSNBC is neither popular nor as terrible as Fox News. It would probably be more popular if it was more terrible, but it sucks a lot and it's part of the landscape. Yeah, I tried. My mom, before she died of cancer, got really into watching MSNBC, and I used to sit with her when I would visit Georgia and talk to her about things when she was still lucid before the chemo and everything started eating away at her cognitive ability. And she would just get really paranoid about the state of the nation and really depressed by watching MSNBC. For a while, I was literally hoping we could put on Russian movie channels off satellite or something to get her to stop rotting her brain from pseudo news. As I have spent with my partner's conservative parents, seeing them do that with Fox News, which is, now the center, right? Boy, have things changed. It leads to weird paranoia to get that kind of feedback loop when you're also a shut-in who's retired. To my eternal regret, I think the late night political comedy show played a role in change. Yes, Amir is regretting it because he's part of it. And of course, there's Twitter. Twitter is much younger and further left in the population. Not anymore, it's not. Now that would be Blue Sky. Actually weird, as I'm on both Blue Sky and have returned to Twitter. Left Twitter is more far left. I mean, it's more just outright Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist, Maoist, etc. than it used to be. A lot less MAGA, blue MAGA, Will Standage kind of people. But those people are all on Blue Sky, and Blue Sky is an echo chamber now, as is the liberal parts of Mastodon. But the right wing, there's also less of a difference between the non-specific subcultural niches that survived the transition to Mutz's X from old Twitter, with tons of right-wing grifters and this, that, and the other, which Elon Musk has, of course, encouraged. So now Twitter is neither younger nor for the left in the population. And also, since 2022, we're... well, I want to say that we're actually not a slightly younger population because the largest generation is now millennials, and they're well into their early 40s and their late 30s. Hopefully they've had kids by now. They probably haven't. I know I haven't. All right. And of course, there's Twitter, which is much longer and further left in the population. And it includes every journalist in America. It's part of their job now. Luckily, that's ending. I actually thought the Twitterification of both academia and journalism was a fucking disaster. But, that's just me. Further, a guy who got off Twitter for 6 months. Furthermore, journalists are far more likely than any other people to take Twitter as real life. Not anymore, they're not. We've created a cliquey, performative environment that's 10 times worse than the Viper Pit of high school, and then require the country's most influential people to spend large amounts of their time there. That is true. Doing media outreach through niche, ideologically driven subcultures is objectively a bad idea. I mean, this is something Marxists should actually take hold to. We should not be tailing the right or the left, but we also should not be only speaking to our weird, tiny, in the grand scheme of things, ideological niches. Now, I'm probably chief sinner here, as I don't really give a fuck who watches this show, and I will speak to anyone who's interested. But I do think that needs to be more of the Marxist left's job. And in addition to that, and maybe more importantly, to do it without tailing or without kissing the Democrats' ring, which we can't seem to not do one or the other, or one is a subset of the other anyway, so both. We've created a cliquely performative-based environment that's 10 times worse than the vibrant public high school that required the country's most influential people to spend large amounts of their time there. This is the environment in which simplistic worldview sees all things as zero-sum conflict between the oppressor and oppressed has bubbled up. Yes. Yes, it has. I'm not sure if this view is actually more common than before or just more prominent. It might be that it exists at similar levels as it did in the past, but it gets more attention now. That's actually my suspicion. As a dirty radical leftist, I also find nuanced statements about oppression to be problematic. There are scenarios where I think it is entirely correct to be unnuanced. I am on the record for saying that about Palestine. Although even there, I think there are some understandings that are frankly delusional. But nonetheless, you know, I am unequivocally for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. So you know where I stand. It is certainly true that Twitter puts you in touch with colossal morons who used to be unable to reach you, and what a fantastic service. And I've seen that destroy media personalities. I really have. People I've known and liked who have gotten Twitter brainworms and either doggedly gotten on to every weird twin and giving the weird twins on Twitter more substantive covering than you should, or they have responded to those weird trends by counter-tailing or moving to any critique of them, and not building a material basis of analysis that's not based on fucking media or whatever the political talking points of the last 2 years are. And this is a problem. This is endemic even the people I like, and they need to fucking stop it, but I'm not going to get them to, because that's how you get eyes on Twitter. Or X, or whatever the fuck you want to call it these days. And even though X is way more right-wing than old Twitter, that sorting function and the bad incentives are actually pretty much the same. The bad incentives don't exist as much on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, because those are actually much more censorious companies. And even that gets weird. So, if you've ever spent time on conspiracy TikTok, it's a very strange place. All right. At any rate, this view has become definitely more influential than it used to be. Ideas that used to mostly exist at teach-ins at Antioch College and stage banter from all-female punk bands have gone mainstream. I mean, I don't necessarily think all that's bad, my bro, but I think the movement's focus on race, gender, and other identities has made many on the left not quite know how to respond. Any discrimination based on race, gender, and sexual orientation is so central to liberals' identity that we become easy marks. Saying this is anti-racist to a liberal is like saying this is anti-fire to Frankenstein. We're very likely to buy whatever you're selling. The appeal is very deeply held values combined with social penalty for appealing to betray those values has made us slow to call bullshit on spurious charges of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and so the zombie mind virus spread. I feel like this is aimed at Robin DiAngelo. All right, so now we have the zombie mind virus, liberals, smart conservatives, dead GOP 2022. And interestingly, the brain tailors are also moving to the right. So this is one element of this that I think is actually true. That some of these identity-based, and look, I'm not anti-identity politics at all. I realize that that's always going to be with us, and actually it's one of the things that I think is going to be with us even if we achieve communism or whatever. I don't think there's an easy answer for that just by dealing with the modes of production. But it is interesting how there is a trail that this comic actually rightly articulates that leads to a kind of weird woke to anti-woke, left to right pattern. All right. I think the left is very much in turmoil. All of American politics is in turmoil. And Jeff, you're not really getting into why, but we'll come to that later. 2022 seemed to be a high watermark of the craziness, but things are still dicey. Well, that might be because we were all shut in for a while for legitimate reasons. I'm far from ready to say that the sanity has worn out. After all, there was a movement in 2013 where it looked like Republicans were going to tack towards the center, and we all know how that went. There was even a memo after Romney lost. The main thing I want to communicate with this panel, that things have been feeling most strongly recently, is that this ideology is not liberal. Well, no shit. Nor is it progressive or left, according to most definitions. Which definitions we're going by there, buddy? I think the closer look at this way of thinking reveals that it could be completely antithetical to Americans' left liberal tradition. Oh, well, I mean, yeah, but also not. We have to ask, why is that left liberal tradition mutating like this? I think trying to say that it comes from outside the left liberal tradition as a mind virus is giving the left liberal tradition's coherence a lot more coherence than it's ever had. And also, Jeff Maurer is my age, which means neither one of us have living memory of the 60s and 70s, where we saw shit like this before. Anyway. As many people point out, this trend is clearly not liberal. Liberalism values things like free speech, except when it comes across property rights, individual rights, except when it comes across property rights, and due process, especially for property rights. This new movement sees free speech as a fig leaf for white supremacy. Yeah, that's misguided, but I know why they think that. Focuses on group outcomes at the expense of individual rights. That's not unique, buddy. It's not even unique to things like Marxism. Replaces due process with Twitter justice, the only form of justice that makes trial by monkey seem rational and fair. This movement is liberal by the way that Blue Velvet is a kid's movie. I would go even further. I often feel like this movement isn't strictly progressive or on the left in a substantive way. We use labels. I use labels like progressive and left because this is a newish phenomenon and we're struggling to find the language that works. Well, I think that liberal progressivism is dying because the economic conditions that undergirded it after World War II are ending, and it's fragmenting in weird ways. And I agree that, believe it or not, I agree with some of the centrists that some of the ways it's fragmented are particularly problematic and frankly foolish, but no one really knows what to do because liberalism, as it was currently constituted, seems pretty broken by its own internal contradictions. But I often think those words don't fit. After all, progressivism has a defining trait. Then it must be distributing resources towards the disadvantaged. Yes, to avoid communists like me taking over is really what it was about, but whatever, you're still correct. So why are so-called progressives calling for extremely regressive universal loan forgiveness? How is it extremely regressive? Aha. Why did they advocate for school closures that had devastating to poor kids well past the point of necessity? Why are they altering the college admission process in ways that benefit the wealthy and well-connected? That last bit is true. The first one is student loan forgiveness extremely regressive. Depends on how you pay for it. But I would my critique of universal student loan forgiveness is it actually leaves the student loan system and the corrupt system around universities fairly intact. And I actually think we need to completely rethink that. You need to make student loans more fair and quit picking up on this stuff. You know, rich dude who comes from, who had the opportunity to work for HBO. I think those people calling something that would help both a lot of rich people, but also a lot of poor people are regressive by itself a little bit weird. Why did they advocate for school closures, which were devastating to the poor well past the point of necessity? This one's a bigger question, and it was mostly out of fear. Also, high schools don't operate like elementary schools, and for some reason in this country, I couldn't get anyone to admit that in either direction. But these are like standard IDW parking points. Why are they altering college admission progress in ways that benefit the wealthy and well-connected? That's true. I will say the progressive calls for holistic advantages do and study over and over again actually help the wealthy. And since they've been implemented, we've seen colleges become less diverse. So much so that it's becoming a feedback loop that poor kids just aren't going to try to go anymore. And maybe it's a good thing. I mean, I'm not saying that credentialing was actually great for anything. And while I believe in the universal viability of education, I don't believe you necessarily need to pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars or even thousands of dollars to a brick and mortar institution for all that to happen when you're talking about humanities education and personal enrichment. Why are they undercutting real wages by pursuing ineffective solution to inflation? What ineffective solutions are they pulling? Why are they often the tip of the spear in the fight against lower housing costs? This is true. Actually, I will say this. A lot of the anti-gentrification activists that I've dealt with are about foreclosing on housing stock while not realizing that, or maybe they do realize it, but they don't realize that you can't piecemeal this. By foreclosing on housing stock and stopping development while also trying to make your neighborhood economically viable while also keeping housing prices low when you've limited the housing stock. I mean, that is sort of an impossibility under capitalism. This is progressive. Fuck, this is idiocy. I mean, I think none of this is as obvious as Jeff Maurer, and it's extremely telling what he thinks the standing lines are, but not all of these are wrong. I think the bottom line is that this movement is not defined by finding solutions to problems. No, political movements that are political movements and ideology are never defined by defining solutions to problems, because if they are, and you find the solution to the problem, they cease to exist. That is the problem with mass ideological identification. Marxists should pay attention to this. It's not that you can have no ideology, or that Marxism is going to get you past this, but that if you define this stuff purely in terms of ideology, you have no reason to even want to win. It's about performative flailing against one's perceived enemies. It's Carl Schmitt as LARP. Every issue I listed above is a crusade against someone or something that is on the lefties' enemies list, be it greedy developers, evil corporations, the omnipresent white supremacy. The fact that the impacts of this movement's actions would often hurt the disadvantaged don't seem to faze its believers. This is, while I'm not going to go off, but I'm evil corporations and omnipresent white supremacy are things that I don't think are unreal, but I do think this latter part, particularly when tied with specific forms of left liberalism, actually sticks, which is why this mealy-mouthed centrist ideology has some sticking points right now, in particular. And if you don't believe me, I mean, look at the weird way in which the Democratic Party has tried to move both progressive and mealy-mouthed at the same time on this shit. All right. The fact that the impacts of the movement's mass action will often hurt the disadvantaged doesn't seem to faze its believers, and I think that is telling. They don't look beyond the glorious fight against their evil enemies because the glorious fight is the end goal. Ultimately, this viewpoint bears some similarity to the movement that destroyed the GOP's ability to solve problems. Any consideration beyond the Manichaean struggle against the evil ones has been jettisoned. We call this negative partisanship these days. This is the primitive mind revealing its element like a pig in a pile of shit. There is no quest for a more perfect nation, only the battle between the righteous and the wicked. Well, this is when you misrecognize the friend-enemy distinction and politicize without any political theology or purpose undergirding it. And to have a political theology requires you to have power. Now, you don't have to have power to have a friend-enemy distinction, but that friend-enemy distinction is not going to be particularly meaningful for maintaining a society, and it will often exhaust itself. This movement is trying to gain influence, and they've scored a few victories. If they capture the Democratic Party the way the brain-dead Pujos captured the GOP, I think we're in big trouble. Well, look, you don't have to worry about that. Everybody's brain-dead now, even the centrist. If you ever wondered why I might be wrong logo as a man falling through space, here's why. When I started this blog in mid-2021, I felt extremely unmoored. Institutions I had depended on were changing in ways that seemed to betray their core principles. Or maybe they weren't. Maybe I was changing and I had chosen the wrong touchstones. Or maybe I was deeply wrong about their core principles to begin with, which would bring into question my ability to make judgments about anything. Maybe that's probably true, my bro. I didn't know the cause of the change, but I knew the effect. I was feeling lost, blind, with no fixed points of reference, just spinning through space. I don't know. Maybe there are 1,000 reasons for that, for everyone to feel that way in 2021 to 2022. Much like the guy in the picture, as you may have guessed, he's yellow because I wanted to invoke the scene from 2001: A Space Odyssey. In the last year, I've really gotten my bearings back a bit. The main way I've done that is by realizing that many people feel the same way I do and gaining what is a slightly better understanding of what is going on. The understanding is basically, as I've outlined in this post. Maybe the story feels familiar to you. I'm sure it's imprecise and full of holes. And if you have thoughts, please share them in the comments. This prompt was probably unnecessary. But one thing we know is that, as been proved by the popularity of the stick figure meme, one thing is happening that a lot of people are wondering what's happening. Hopefully, talking through with some help of us reorient ourselves and get back to focusing on progress. Well, we'd have to agree on what progress was, wouldn't we? Wouldn't we, Jeff Maurer? And we don't. And why we don't, you don't get to. Look, I don't have the answer for all that either, but writing about economic ideologies as if they exist outside of a economic context, and of which the media context is in an economic context that's very specific, you can see the media context, but you can't see the larger milieu of what it's situated in. That's a problem, and that's where a lot of centrists stop. Our critiques of, quote, rad libs, a term I don't love, but I use sometimes. So now they say shit libs, whatever you want to say. I don't go into the anti-woke debate because, frankly, I don't think it deals with why that emerged. Why parts of it would be popular with certain parts of the population, not just the, quote, PMC, by the way. And why it would fall off just as quickly when it failed to deliver or was mostly hot air or symbolic stuff to deal with white people's guilt about the Great Reckoning that they barely participated in and just diversified some shows. How hollow all this is probably why people feel unmoored. And we've seen a rapid cycle of this change again so quickly I can't see straight. Now, we shouldn't be surprised about this, and there's been all kinds of ideological defections lately. The third worldist sack coat became Milton Friedmanite. I can't tell you how many left to center and left to right movements I've seen. But I can also tell you that it does seem like hard conservatism, even on the issues of policies where they would be more popular, is still broadly not well liked in this country. And it makes the weird impulse that some leftists have had to tail it even stranger. Because we are in a deeper anti-political moment, and we have been now for probably a decade, where the realization of the failure to deal with the crisis of the 60s and 70s has come upon us. But most of us now are too old or too dead to remember that that world was in crisis too. The middle-aged people, like the people who came up in the 50s, came up in the 80s and 90s, a time period that was not as good as the 50s, but in some ways made us feel rich and untouchable and like there was no other way possible. Where there is a bunch of fucking other ways possible. The way forward is contested. We're still living in the end of history, and that nothing's actually won a new map forward for everyone. But the fact that there is contestation tells you a lot. And no wonder centrists feel lost. And we shouldn't just mock them for that. They are onto something real, but they can't articulate it. We need to answer that question beyond just tailing woke or anti-woke talking points and engaging in the media shitstorm. And if we can't, we don't have answers either, and we deserve what we get. Keep your peace, like and subscribe. Always dream of better tomorrow, but remember, you got to pay for it. In your actions, not your money. There's a Patreon. Hit the bell. Leave a review. You can get access to more stuff for as little as $3 a week. I hope you guys are enjoying the 3 shows a week schedule, because that's about what I can settle on right now. Both my health and my day job have taken a lot more out of me. But I'm not stopping podcasting, and I'm also going to get better. So I'm also going to keep my peace. Take care.